They called her just an old widow. To the small, tight-knit town of Blackwood, Clara Vance was nothing more than a permanent fixture of background noise. She was the frail woman in a faded floral dress who spent her afternoons sitting on a creaky porch swing, watching the world move past her with vacant, roomy eyes. People walked past her house every single day without a second thought. To the local real estate developers, she was an eyesore, a stubborn roadblock sitting on prime, multi-million-dollar land. To her neighbors, she was a quiet ghost clinging to a crumbling house that smelled of peppermint and old newspapers. They thought they knew everything there was to know about her. They thought her story was simple, tragic, and entirely ordinary. But they didn't know a single thing. They didn't know about the locked iron cellar beneath her floorboards, the heavy wooden crates stamped with government seals, or the classified ledger that contained names of the town's most powerful figures. They had no idea that this fragile, forgotten woman was holding a fuse that, once lit, would completely shatter the town's history and expose a decades-old conspiracy. They called her just an old widow because it was easier than looking closer. And that was their first, and most dangerous, mistake. For 40 years, Clara Vance lived a life of absolute, calculated invisibility. In a world that thrives on attention, where everyone clamors to be seen, Clara mastered the art of being entirely forgotten. The town of Blackwood had grown around her, transforming from a sleepy coal mining community into a bustling, affluent suburb driven by corporate expansion. Yet, Clara's property remained entirely unchanged, like a stubborn island of the past marooned in a sea of modern concrete. Her house was a weather-worn Victorian structure, its paint peeling like sunburned skin, surrounded by overgrown weeds and an iron fence covered in rust. To the modern eye, it looked like abandonment. But to Clara, it was a fortress. The contrast couldn't be sharper. On one side of the street stood the gleaming, glass-fronted offices of Blackwood Development Holdings, on the other side sat Clara's decaying porch. The executives looked out their pristine windows and saw a weak link, a minor inconvenience they could easily sweep aside with a standard legal eviction or a lowball offer. They assumed that a woman of her age, living entirely alone without any surviving family, would naturally crumble under the slightest bit of pressure. They figured she was weak because she was quiet. They failed to realize that the quietest oceans often harbor the most devastating storms. The pressure began to mount on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Julian Cross, the ambitious chief executive of Blackwood Development, decided to personally deliver the final buyout notice. Julian was a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted through slick suits, expensive lawyers, and a predatory smile. He viewed Clara as a simple negotiation exercise, a brief stop on his way to securing a multi-million-dollar commercial expansion project. Walking up her creaky steps, he felt a wave of pity mixed with irritation. When Clara opened the door, she looked exactly as he expected, a slight frame, silver hair tied back in a loose bun, and hands that trembled slightly as she held a porcelain teacup. He offered her a check that would have made any ordinary person pack their bags instantly. He spoke to her using the slow, patronizing tone people often reserve for the elderly, assuming her silence was a sign of confusion. But Clara didn't look at the check. Instead, she looked directly into Julian's eyes with a cold, piercing intensity that froze the smile right off his face. She didn't yell, she didn't get angry, and she didn't negotiate. She simply took the paperwork, folded it neatly in half, and handed it back to him. Then, in a voice that was completely steady, devoid of any age-related frailty, she said, "You are building your foundation on top of a graveyard, Mr. Cross. I suggest you stop digging before you uncover what put them there." Julian laughed it off as the ramblings of a senile mind, but as he walked back to his luxury vehicle, an unsettling chill settled deep in his chest. He ordered his legal team to aggressively accelerate the foreclosure process, determined to force her out by any means necessary. But as the corporate machine began to grind against Clara Vance, strange anomalies started to surface. The developers sent land surveyors to map out her property lines, but every digital instrument they used malfunctioned the moment they crossed her perimeter fence. High-end GPS equipment errored out, drone cameras caught nothing but static when flying over her roof, and ancient property deeds in a county archives mysteriously vanished from the digital database overnight. It was as if Clara's home didn't just exist in physical space, but was actively defying modern technology. The rumors in town began to shift from mild pity to deep, uneasy curiosity. The local kids whispered that the old widow was a witch, while the older generation recalled vague, shadowed memories from the late 1970s, a time when Blackwood was gripped by the sudden, unexplained disappearance of three prominent town founders. People began to realize that no one actually knew where Clara had come from. She had simply appeared in the winter of 1982, buying the house with cash, and had never been seen with a single friend, relative, or visitor since. The tension reached a boiling point when a local investigative journalist named Marcus Reed decided to look into the anomalies surrounding the Vance estate. Marcus was skeptical of town folklore, but he possessed a sharp instinct for uncovering corporate corruption. He suspected that Julian Cross was using illegal tactics to force Clara out. And he wanted to expose the developer's predatory practices. Marcus spent days digging through microfiche records at the local library, searching for any historical connection between Clara Vance and the town's elite. What he stumbled upon wasn't a story of corporate bullying, but a terrifying web of classified government contracts, industrial espionage, and millions of dollars in unaccounted wealth that traced back directly to the very room where Clara sat every single day. He discovered that Clara Vance didn't legally exist prior to 1982. Her identity was a perfectly constructed ghost, a phantom creation designed to shield someone of immense importance. As Marcus sat in his dark office, staring at a grainy, 40-year-old surveillance photograph of a young woman standing next to a top-secret military research facility, the pieces finally began to fall into place. The frail old widow on the porch wasn't a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a guardian keeping watch over a secret that could completely dismantle the entire region's power structure. And Marcus had just accidentally tripped the wire. Marcus couldn't breathe. The air in his small office felt suddenly heavy, thick with the realization that he had stumbled into a labyrinth with no clear exit. The grainy photograph on his monitor seemed to stare back at him, challenging his understanding of reality. The young woman in the military-grade surveillance photo possessed the exact same sharp, unyielding gaze he had seen in Clara Vance's eyes just days prior. But the setting was completely alien. She wasn't standing on a dilapidated porch in a dying town, she was dressed in a sleek, dark tactical uniform, standing outside a heavily fortified subterranean bunker nestled deep within the Nevada desert. The timestamp on the file read October 14, 1981, just months before Clara arrived in Blackwood with a suitcase full of cash and a determination to become entirely invisible. Driven by an adrenaline-fueled obsession, Marcus began cross-referencing the declassified project names associated with that desert facility. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. It was known as Project Ethelgard, a highly sensitive, deeply unethical Cold War counterintelligence operation tasked with developing advanced tracking systems, psychological warfare protocols, and the management of high-value political assets. The project had been abruptly terminated in late 1981 following a massive, catastrophic data breach and the mysterious disappearance of its chief operations officer, a brilliant but ruthless master strategist known only by her codename, the Civ. She was given that title because no secret, no matter how securely locked away, could ever escape her grasp. She was the ultimate filter of information, deciding who lived, who died, and which historical events were allowed to make it into the public record. When she vanished, she didn't just walk away with state secrets, she took a physical ledger containing the true identities, offshore accounts, and blackmail material of hundreds of deep-cover operatives, corrupt politicians, and industrial titans. The pieces were locking into place with a terrifying, rhythmic clicking sound. Clara Vance wasn't a sad, lonely widow mourning a lost life. She was a master of espionage who had chosen Blackwood as her ultimate hiding place because its deep coal mines and geographic isolation provided the perfect tactical shield against satellite tracking and electronic surveillance. For 40 years, she had watched the town grow, knowing that the very foundations of Blackwood Development Holdings were built using the laundered blood money generated by the original architects of Project Ethelgard. Julian Cross wasn't just an arrogant local developer trying to build a new commercial shopping center. Marcus discovered that Julian's grandfather, Arthur Cross, was one of the three town founders who had mysteriously vanished in 1982. Arthur Cross hadn't been murdered by a random drifter, as the local police file suggested. He had been a rogue operative from Project Ethelgard who had tracked the Civ to Blackwood, attempting to retrieve the ledger and eliminate her. He had failed. Marcus realized with sudden, absolute horror that Julian Cross had no idea what his grandfather had actually been doing, nor did he understand the true nature of the land he was trying to seize. Julian thought he was fighting a legal battle against a stubborn old woman to build an office complex. In reality, he was blindly swinging a sledgehammer at a dormant landmine that had been buried in the soil for nearly half a century. If Julian's construction crews brought in heavy machinery to excavate Clara's property, they wouldn't just tear down an old Victorian house. They would breach the reinforced concrete bunker beneath her cellar, triggering an automated, hardwired security protocol that would instantly broadcast 40 years of classified, highly damaging international secrets directly to every major news outlet and intelligence agency on the planet. The fallout would be global, catastrophic, and completely irreversible. Determined to stop a disaster before it could begin, Marcus grabbed his jacket and keys, rushing out into the pouring rain. He needed to confront Clara, to tell her that he knew the truth, and to warn her that Julian Cross was planning to bypass the standard legal channels entirely. Through his corporate contacts, Marcus had just learned that Julian had hired a private, heavily armed security firm to forcibly evict Clara under the cover of darkness that very night, using a fabricated municipal emergency order as legal cover. The town of Blackwood was about to become a battleground, and the unsuspecting residents sleeping in their nearby suburban homes had no idea they were living on the edge of a knife. As Marcus sped through the dark, winding streets toward the edge of town, the rain lashed violently against his windshield. The contrast between the peaceful, sleeping neighborhood and the incoming storm was suffocating. He pulled up to the curb a block away from Clara's house, turning off his headlights to avoid drawing attention. The Victorian structure loomed in the darkness, a dark silhouette against the gray sky. But as Marcus stepped out of his car, his heart skipped a beat. Two unmarked, black SUVs were already parked in the shadows directly down the street from Clara's rusted iron fence. The private security team had arrived early. Through the sheets of rain, Marcus saw 4 large men in tactical gear stepping out of the vehicles. They moved with military precision, carrying specialized breaching tools and heavy tactical equipment. They didn't look like standard security guards, they looked like professional operators trained to make people disappear without leaving a trace. Marcus knew he couldn't face them directly, but he couldn't just stand by and watch an innocent woman, even an incredibly dangerous former spy, get captured or killed. Slipping through the overgrown brush of the neighboring yard, Marcus desperately searched for a way to warn Clara before the team breached her front door. He crept toward the side of the house, his boots sinking into the thick mud, his eyes fixed on the dim, warm light glowing from the single kitchen window on the ground floor. Inside, he could see the silhouette of Clara Vance calmly pouring a cup of tea, completely oblivious to the armed threat closing in on her perimeter. Or so he thought. Marcus reached the side window, his breath fogging the cold glass. He tapped frantically against the frame, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Inside, Clara didn't jump. She didn't flinch or look startled. She slowly set her porcelain teacup down on the saucer with a soft, deliberate click. Turned her head toward the window, and locked her eyes directly onto Marcus. With a calm, slow motion of her hand, she pointed toward the back door of the kitchen. Marcus scrambled through the mud, slipping around the rear of the house, and found the heavy wooden door already clicking open before he could even reach for the handle. He tumbled into the warm, brightly lit kitchen, drenched and shivering from the rain and sheer terror. "Clara, you have to leave right now." Marcus gasped, wiping water from his eyes. Julian Cross sent men. Private security operators. They're outside in unmarked SUVs, and they're carrying breaching gear. They are going to force their way in here, and they aren't planning to leave any witnesses. I know who you are. I know about Project Ethelgard. I know about the ledger. Clara stood by the old stove, looking entirely unbothered by the frantic young journalist standing in her kitchen. The slight tremor Marcus had noticed in her hands during her meeting with Julian Cross was completely gone. Her posture was perfectly rigid, her shoulders squared with the unyielding grace of a military commander. A faint, knowing smile played at the corners of her lips. "I know they are outside, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping into a rich, resonant tone that carried an undeniable authority. "In fact, I've been tracking their satellite communications for the last 3 hours. And as for Project Ethelgard, I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in 44 years. You're a remarkably resourceful young man to have dug that up." Before Marcus could respond, a heavy, muffled thud echoed from the front porch. The security operators had cut the chain-link gate and were moving into position. The sound of a hydraulic breaching tool pressing against the heavy oak front door vibrated through the floorboards. Marcus panicked, looking around the kitchen for a weapon, a back exit, or a place to hide. "We need to run," he whispered loudly. "There are 4 of them, and they are heavily armed." Clara calmly walked over to a seemingly ordinary wooden spice rack hanging on the wall. She slid her fingers behind the frame, pressing a hidden recessed button. Instantly, a heavy, mechanical hum sounded from beneath the linoleum floor. The massive, cast-iron stove slid back with surprising smoothness, revealing a steep, brightly illuminated concrete staircase leading straight down into the earth. "Running is for people who are unprepared, Marcus," Clara said softly, gesturing toward the stairs. "I have spent 40 years preparing for this exact night. Grab your coat and follow me. And please, try not to touch the walls." As Marcus stepped onto the concrete stairs, Clara followed him down, pulling the spice rack back into place. Above them, the heavy iron stove slid shut with a solid, airtight seal just as the thunderous sound of the front door exploding inward echoed through the upper house. The subterranean staircase led deep under the foundation, far deeper than any standard residential cellar. The walls weren't rough dirt or stone, they were reinforced with thick plates of ballistic steel and lined with glowing LED status monitors, tactical servers, and ancient but immaculately maintained communication arrays. This wasn't a root cellar. It was a fully functional, state-of-the-art tactical command center hidden directly beneath a crumbling Victorian facade. At the center of the room sat a massive steel table covered in physical ledgers, encrypted hard drives, and a bank of monitors displaying real-time video feeds from dozens of hidden cameras scattered around the exterior and interior of the property. Marcus watched the screens in fascination and horror. On the monitors, the 4 heavily armed security operators were moving through Clara's vacant living room, their weapons raised, checking corners with professional precision. They looked thoroughly confused, realizing their target had vanished into thin air within a matter of seconds. "They think they are the hunters," Clara remarked, pulling a small, encrypted tablet from a charging dock on the main console. She tapped the screen twice. On the video monitors, heavy steel blast shutters suddenly slammed down over every single window and door on the upper level of the house, sealing the 4 operators inside a literal steel cage. The men spun around in a panic, hammering uselessly against the reinforced barriers. But they failed to realize that this house was never a home. It is a trap designed to capture anyone foolish enough to try to steal the secrets buried beneath it. Marcus stared at the monitors, then looked back at Clara, his mind spinning. "What happens now?" he asked. "You can't keep them locked up in your living room forever. Julian Cross will realize his team failed, and he'll send more men, or the police. Julian Cross is currently sitting in his penthouse suite, watching his investment portfolio crumble," Clara replied coolly, her fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard with dizzying speed. "The moment his men breached my perimeter fence, an automated sequence was initiated. 40 years of financial data tracing Blackwood Development's funding directly back to illegal Cold War weapons manufacturing was just uploaded to the Federal Reserve and the Department of Justice. By sunrise, Julian won't have a company left to manage, let alone the resources to hire mercenaries." She walked over to the center table and picked up a thick, leather-bound book with a heavy brass lock. This was the legendary ledger, the physical artifact that had kept the world's most powerful people living in absolute terror for nearly half a century. "For 40 years, I sat on that porch playing the part of a fragile old widow because it was the safest way to keep this ledger out of the wrong hands," she said, her voice softening slightly. "The world thought I was hiding from my past. But in reality, I was protecting the future from the monsters who built it." Marcus stared at the leather-bound book, his hands trembling as he realized he was looking at the most dangerous artifact of the modern era. The room was deathly quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the servers and the frantic, muted thuds of the mercenaries trapped in the living room above their heads. Clara's victory seemed absolute, a masterclass in deep-cover espionage and long-term planning. But as Marcus looked closer at the real-time data feed scrolling across the main command monitor, his eyes caught a flashing red indicator that made his breath catch in his throat. A secondary countdown timer had just initiated on the main screen, ticking down from precisely 12 minutes. It wasn't linked to the financial data upload, nor was it part of the lockdown protocol. It was something entirely separate, buried deep within the core architecture of Project Ethelgard's automated defense network. Clara. Marcus stammered, pointing a shaky finger at the monitor. If Julian Cross's company is already ruined, and the mercenaries are trapped, what is that timer counting down to? What happens when it hits 0? Clara froze. For the very first time since Marcus had tumbled into her life, the unyielding composure on her face fractured, replaced by a sudden, stark paleness. She lunged toward the console, her fingers moving across the keys not with calculated precision, but with a desperate, frantic speed. "No," she whispered, her voice losing its icy authority and dropping into an undertone of genuine panic. "It's not possible. The system shouldn't have recognized that signature. Not unless he is still alive." Marcus felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. "Who is alive, Clara? Who are you talking about?" Clara didn't look up from the screen, her eyes reflecting the crimson glow of the countdown. "Arthur Cross," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cooling fans. "The town founder who supposedly vanished in 1982. The man everyone assumed I eliminated when he tracked me here 44 years ago. I didn't kill him, Marcus. He escaped, but he was badly wounded. I thought he died in hiding decades ago. But this automated sequence, it requires a biometric override that only 2 people in the world possess. Mine, and his. The moment Julian's men breached the house, it didn't just trigger my defense network. It pinged a dormant receiver located less than 3 miles from where we are standing right now. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. The entire corporate war with Julian Cross hadn't been an accident of modern real estate development. It had been a carefully orchestrated setup. Julian hadn't found this property on his own, he had been guided to it, used as a blind pawn by his own grandfather to force Clara to activate her command center and reveal her location. The real threat wasn't the 4 mercenaries trapped upstairs in the living room. They were just the bait, a sacrificial play designed to make Clara lock herself inside her own bunker. The countdown, Marcus pressed, his heart pounding in his ears. "What does it do?" "It's a hardwired purge protocol," Clara said, turning to face him, the full weight of her 40-year vigil collapsing onto her features. "If both biometric keys aren't entered simultaneously before the timer reaches 0, the bunker doesn't just erase its data. It activates a thermite demolition charge embedded directly within the bedrock beneath this foundation. It will instantly vaporize everything within a 2-block radius to ensure the ledger never falls into enemy hands. It was designed as a failsafe during the Cold War to prevent Soviet capture. If Arthur doesn't enter his key, we don't just lose the secrets. Marcus. This entire neighborhood vanishes into a crater." Before Marcus could even process the horror of what she was saying, the main communication console flared to life. The audio static hissed loudly through the subterranean bunker speakers, followed by the sound of a heavy, ragged breath. A voice rasped through the speakers, a voice that sounded like grinding stones, ancient, frail, yet dripping with a terrifying, venomous amusement. "Hello, Clara," the voice whispered through the static. "It's been a very long time since we played this game." Clara stepped toward the microphone, her hands clenching into fists so tight her knuckles turned white. "Arthur," she hissed. "You're too late. The financial data has already been transmitted. Your grandson's empire is gone. You have nothing left to fight for." A low, dry chuckle echoed through the bunker. "You always did think 3 steps ahead, Clara, but you forgot to look behind you," Arthur's voice rasped. "I don't care about Julian, or his pathetic real estate company. I care about the ledger. I care about finishing the job I started in 1982. Look at your camera feed for Sector 7. The old coal mine entrance on the ridge. See who is standing at my terminal." Marcus scrambled to the secondary monitors, switching the feed to the remote camera overlooking the abandoned Blackwood coal mine on the edge of town. Through the infrared lens, he saw a heavily hunched, elderly figure breathing through an oxygen tank, standing in front of a rusted, military-grade terminal hidden inside the mine shaft. But Arthur wasn't alone. Standing directly behind him, with a cold, blank expression on his face, was the chief of the Blackwood Police Department, holding a service weapon. You see, Clara, Arthur's voice chuckled through the static, the town belongs to me. It always has. I am sitting at my terminal, and my hand is hovering over the override key. I will enter my biometric data and stop the demolition sequence on one condition, and one condition only. You have exactly 9 minutes to bring the physical ledger up to the surface and hand it to my men. If you try to transmit the ledger digitally, my terminal will detect the bandwidth spike and abort the sequence instantly, detonating the charges early. Arthur paused, the sound of his oxygen machine wheezing through the line. If you stay in your hole, you die, the boy dies, and the neighborhood burns. If you come out, you give me the ledger, and you finally get to rest. The choice is yours, Civ. But you better hurry. The clock is ticking, and I've waited 44 years to watch you lose. The line went dead, leaving nothing but the aggressive, rhythmic ticking of the red countdown clock on the main screen. Marcus turned to Clara, his mind completely blank with terror. They were trapped 50 feet underground, surrounded by ballistic steel, with a bomb beneath their feet and a corrupt police force waiting for them on the surface. There was no backup coming, no legal system to save them, and no time left to think. Marcus stared at the countdown timer. 8:42, 8:41. The crimson numbers reflected off the cold steel of the bunker, ticking away the remaining seconds of their lives. He looked at Clara, expecting to see the calculating strategist, the legendary Civ, who always had a hidden card up her sleeve. But for a brief, terrifying moment, she just looked like an old woman standing in the dark, holding a heavy book that had cost her everything she had ever loved. Clara, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. What do we do? We can't give him the ledger. If Arthur Cross gets those names, he reinstates Project Ethelgard. He controls the country. But if we stay here? Clara looked up, and the vulnerability in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, brilliant spark of absolute defiance. Arthur thinks he knows me because we were trained by the same monsters, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, steady whisper. He thinks my survival instinct will make me surrender the ledger to save my own skin. He completely forgot why I took it in the first place. She marched over to the main console, grabbed a heavy tactical knife from a drawer, and did something that made Marcus gasp. She didn't slice open a wire or pry open a panel. Instead, she slammed the butt of the knife into the glass face of the main countdown monitor, shattering it into a spiderweb of cracks. Beneath the screen lay a small, analog toggle switch painted in bright, hazard yellow. He told me that if I transmitted the ledger digitally, his terminal would detect the bandwidth spike and detonate the charges early, Clara said, a grim smile spreading across her face. He's entirely right. A standard satellite transmission would trip his sensors instantly. But he's expecting a modern signal. He forgets that this bunker was built in 1978. It doesn't just run on fiber optics, Marcus. It runs on the old subterranean copper lines of the Blackwood coal telephone network, lines that aren't connected to the modern internet, lines his terminal can't monitor. She threw the yellow switch. Deep within the walls of the bunker, a massive mechanical relay clicked open with the sound of a gunshot. I am not transmitting the ledger to a news outlet or a government agency, Clara whispered, her fingers flying across an ancient, analog dialing pad. I am broadcasting the entire audio recording of Arthur's confession, along with the encrypted-decrypted keys of the ledger, directly onto the emergency broadcast frequency of every police cruiser, fire truck, and local radio station within a 50-mile radius. It's an unmasking, Marcus. And it starts right now. Above them, the sirens of the town began to wail. Through the radio arrays in the bunker, they could hear the sudden, chaotic chatter of confused police officers listening to Arthur Cross's raspy voice bragging about his 40-year conspiracy over their own tactical radios. The chief of police, standing in the mine shaft, was exposed to his own men in a matter of seconds. Clara grabbed Marcus by the arm, thrusting the heavy leather ledger into his hands. The countdown is tied to the main power grid. When I cut the main breakers, the thermite charges will disarm, but the blast shutters above will lock permanently. There is an old ventilation shaft behind that server rack that leads up into the woods behind the property. You take the ledger, you run, and you never look back. What about you? Marcus cried out over the rising hum of the broadcasting transmitters. They called me just an old widow, Marcus, Clara said, her eyes burning with an ancient, triumphant fire as she reached for the main power kill switch. It's time I finally live up to the name. She slammed the switch down. The bunker plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. Marcus scrambled through the narrow, dusty ventilation shaft, the heavy leather ledger pressed tightly against his chest. His knees scraped against the cold metal as he climbed desperately toward the faint smell of rain and pine needles. Behind him, the subterranean fortress of Clara Vance was dead, its power cut, its secrets sealed forever beneath thousands of tons of ballistic steel and concrete. When he finally burst through the rusted iron grate on the forest floor, he collapsed onto the wet mud, gasping for air. The night sky above Blackwood was no longer dark, it was illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of dozens of state police cruisers tearing down the mountain toward the abandoned coal mine. The broadcast had worked. The corrupt network had collapsed from the inside out in a matter of minutes. Arthur Cross and his inner circle were being surrounded by their own forces. Marcus looked back down at the dark silhouette of the Victorian house sitting quietly at the edge of the woods. There was no sign of Clara Vance. The mercenaries were still trapped inside, waiting for a rescue that would never come. She had vanished into the shadows of the town she had protected for 40 years, a ghost once again, leaving behind a legacy that would rewrite history. What an incredible journey through the shadows of Blackwood. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel. This tale proves that the most dangerous secrets are often hidden right in front of our eyes, buried beneath the ordinary lives of the people we choose to ignore. But the real mystery doesn't end here. What do you think Marcus should do with the ledger now that he's the sole guardian of the world's most dangerous secrets? Should he destroy it, or should he publish every single name? Let me know your theories in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and stay vigilant, because you never truly know who your neighbors are.